Good evening. We're glad you're all here. When we were in Sydney for 12 years, sometimes once, sometimes twice a year, we'd have Monday night at Macquarie. And if you move everybody in Oklahoma inside the Oklahoma City limits and shut down all the freeways, that's what driving in Sydney is like. There are some parts of town that have 12-hour rush hours. Just bumper to bumper for 12 hours and on and on. And I usually taught school from 9 until 3:30, would stay, and we'd go from 7 to 9:30. I'd catch the train home and sometimes get home somewhere between 11:45 and 12:30. When you're at Liverpool and the guy's hiding behind the screen because he didn't want anybody close to him, we're sorry to announce that the 10:15 train to Liverpool has been canceled. The next train should be coming hopefully in 45 minutes. And on a night like this, I would literally go get in the elevator because it was just this wind-swept platform, and I've got 45 minutes to read or do something, but at least be out of the wind. But it was just such a treat because everybody that came wanted to be there, and it wasn't compulsory. And so that's what we've been doing for our classes here. When I was a student in Memphis, we had 3-hour classes, just met once a week. We had a Greek class that met 4 o'clock on Friday. Yeah. Our Greek teacher, who had 2 doctorate degrees, came in and he said, "Gentlemen, welcome to purgatory." And he came in his running shorts, his tennis shoes, and he said, "I don't know about you, but I'm going to go out and air out after this thing is over." But we had Greek class from 4 o'clock on Friday till 7 or 7:30 till we gave out. So anyway, we're glad you're here. The things that are coming around have a place for our names. If you would like to do refreshments one night, there's a space to do that. And we'll do, Lord willing, the next 5 nights. So we'll do this one and the first 4 in April, and then we'll go from there. BJ, the first handout?
Yes.
We're going to have 3 different sets of handouts today. While I was at Sydney, I was able to do an ancient history study at Macquarie University. And every school has kind of a different priority. And at Macquarie, they tried to have either in print or facsimile, or I've lost that term, stuff that's on the rolls, that's on plastic. Anyway, they tried to have every possible copy of papyri letters that they could find. And so for my project, then I probably read close to 2,000 letters from the 1st and 2nd century. And then my project was saying, okay, here's how letter writing was done. And then here come our letters that are in the New Testament. So our class will be a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. It'll take a little bit for some of it to kind of fit together. But a couple of things hopefully will be of use to you by the time we get finished. Number one, I'm going to maintain that there were very specific directions and a very specific procedure to talk to people to say, this is what I want you to do. And we're going to see some samples tonight. We'll see a little bit of samples each week. And what I'll be sending home with you is just chapters in our New Testament letters. And what we're going to identify, we're going to see these very clearly in these different papyri letters. And the New Testament is not written, the letters are not written to be creative, they're written to be understood. And as we're going to see, even people who are illiterate can communicate through letters. They will go to a scribe, and there are very clearly prescribed conventions. This is how you write the letter. Here's the relationship. Here's the terms that are there. And once you identify these in these letters, and tonight all of our letters, except just this one, will be from the first century, then guess what? When we come to our New Testament letters, they're going to use the same formats and the same things. I don't ever say this is the only thing to emphasize, but in addition to religious education, I went ahead and did a teaching degree for social studies, high school, 7 through 12. And so we had to write a lot of behavioral objectives for classes and for tests and all this other stuff. And so by the time we've worked through this, then, and we'll write them down, you'll be able to look at them, so it'll take us a little bit to get to all of them. But there are some very clear, this is what I want you to do, statements that are in the letters. So if you can stay with me by the time we go through this, then this will give you kind of a different handle on that. I didn't bring it out. On Sunday morning, we have a chart of 3 different colors, and we'll wait and do that next week. And what you will see is that both in the opening, the prologue, the body, and the conclusion, there are 12 to 15 different things that Paul will use part of these in every letter. And what this will help you to do is that it will just help to identify the structure, how things are put together, but very specifically, this is what he's going to call and ask them to do. The first one I want to look at, and this one isn't a petition letter, but it just happens to be my favorite. I highlighted in yellow, see the Roman numeral 2? Here, there's not, some of these will give very specific years of the emperor that we're going to look at later tonight. So on this one, the good news of a wedding, it's going to be from the 2nd century, and they're not quite sure any more details than that. But a couple of things that I want you to notice. Here are, and it says Apollonius and Serapis to Dionysia, greetings. And we'll talk about the greetings more later. And what I want you to notice is there's nothing Christian about these people. But as I read through, and I'll leave it to you just to kind of, after I read through, come back, there are some very distinctive Christian words in a non-Christian letter. Everybody understand what I'm saying by that? So we're going to hear terms that we hear in Paul, but these people are just secular people in society, and we're going to come across some very clear parallels. Oh, here's what a word meant when it was used in society before it was in the New Testament. And these parallels then give us a context. Okay, this is how people were using this word in the time, particularly of the earliest church. So I'm just going to read through, and you just notice, we'll come back and just leave it to you. What words are you going to notice that we tend to hear in letters in the New Testament? Apollonius and Serapis to Dionysia. So we're going to have a couple writing to, as we're going to see, a mother. You filled us with joy when you announced the good news of most noble Seraphim's marriage. Stuart, does this sound familiar? I'm sorry, we're not going to have a dress code tonight, but we're going to announce the coming of a wedding. We would have come straightway to give him our support on a day most prayed for by us and to join in the rejoicing, but in view of the judicial circuit and the fact that we are recovering from sickness, we're not able to come. So what do we know about these people already? Okay, they've been sick. Their friend has sent them a letter, and in this letter they said, oh, our son's going to be getting married, but we're not able to come because we're involved with this is going to come from an upper level society. Some of our other letters are going to come from lower, but when you look at this tonight, you'll be able to see, okay, Here's a couple responding to a request that they got. There are not yet many roses in bloom here. Rather, they are hard to come by. And from all the properties and all the garland weavers, we were scarcely able to get the 1,000 that we sent to you by Serapis, even though we picked blooms which ought not to have been picked till tomorrow. For as much as you wanted, hence in place of the 2,000 you wrote for, in place of the 2,000 you wrote for, we sent 4,000, and they're talking about the narcissi, another flower. We do not want you to condemn us as penny pinchers, that you write in mockery that you've sent the money, when we hold the youngsters as our own children and have a great regard for them, and love them more than our own, and thus our joy is equal to yours and their fathers. Write to us about the other things. Greet the most noble Alexandrus and Serapion, Theon, Arsticulia, and may the evil eye not touch them, and Arsticilia's children. Serapis will confirm to you about the roses. I have done all that I could and sent you as many as you wanted, but we could not locate them. We pray that you're doing well. So it looks like they have sent several thousand flowers for the wedding. That's what I'm saying. What are some terms that we hear, and again, especially may the evil eye not touch you? These aren't believers, these aren't Christians. But what terms are you hearing in secular society that is also terms that we're going to hear in the New Testament?
Expressing their love for someone else.
Okay. There's a real deep sense of affection, and we would use in the New Testament the word agape in terms of how the love is expressed. Well done. What else?
Talk about joy.
Yes, look at the expression of joy. And it's hidden a little bit in the translation, but when you go back, do you see the term on the second line? You announced the good news. That's the word euangelion, and guess what that word is in English? Gospel. Does that ring a bell? And so here is a secular, everybody signed in? Just leave it on the side, maybe one or two, if they come in, we'll have to do that. So here is a couple writing to a lady, and she has heard the news that there's going to be a wedding, and the right word to use for that is the word gospel. And we have heard the gospel, the announcement of the good news of the wedding, and we are filled with joy. And what I love about things like this is that here again is well, let me say it the other way. And we're going to come to this in a second. If you've been in the church for any period of time, and especially our older preachers, and I'm not putting anybody down, I'm just making a comment, you will have heard our older preachers make a comment from Thayer's lexicon. You'll hear Thayer's in terms of like a dictionary, like a lexicon. Thayer's was written in the 1800s. And when the original Thayer's came out, he listed 500 what he called Holy Spirit words. And at that particular time, they had not been able to find these words in any other place. They weren't in like the literature, the books, and the other things that were written. And they didn't. It was an educated guess, and I'm not putting him down. Where did those words come from? And so they felt like, shoo. Somehow the Holy Spirit had introduced these words into the New Testament. But you stop and think about it. Would you write 500 words in the New Testament that nobody knows to help them to understand what's going on? So what we're going to see tonight is that in the late 1800s, especially as they discovered more papyri, which were in the sands of Egypt, we'll talk about this in a second, In the mid-70s, the 500 was less than 50. And today, I would be surprised if it's more than 10 or 15. And so, again, our New Testament letters are not written to be creative, and Paul doesn't want them to read this and say, wow, wasn't that wonderful? What did that mean? He's going to go to great lengths to use both vocabulary and a structure that the people were accustomed to, and that's how he's going to write the letters. And we're going to see samples of this in different ways as we go through tonight. On the back of this, and I'll leave you to read most of this, you can kind of read this on your own. Egypt was a nursery, and if we do it from north to south, the snow was up in the mountains to the north, and when it melted, the Nile overflowed. And the highest percentage that I've read is only about 3% of Egypt is inhabitable. And the rest is just barren sand, and it doesn't rain. And so the Nile is kind of like I-40, and thankfully a lot of times the wind blew from the mountains to the sea, but you could be carried down by the current, which meant a lot of times, let me reverse that. A lot of times the wind blew up from the Mediterranean and blew upstream, and so you could put your sails up and use the wind to get upstream, going downstream, roll up, go down with the Nile. And so people are going to live, in terms of Egypt, in about 3% of the inhabitable territory of the land. But, as we're going to see, because of these places that weren't close to the Nile, if it doesn't rain, things aren't going to rot. So just anticipate that, and we'll look at that for a second. If you look at the next page, this is the sail of a loom. Everybody find this one? And notice the date is AD 54. So I'm just going to read the paragraph of the translation on the right, but this is what I loved about these is that these letters came from, and the British would call it the tip, we would call it the dump, and you just stop and think, if you just throw away household items, letters, receipts, tax items, and on, and then it gets buried in sand, and how hot is it in Egypt? And the only thing that decays these, if the little sandworms get in and eat on the papyri, there can be some holes in it. It's kept for nearly 2,000 years at perfect museum temperature. Because if there's any moisture in it, the sun, with sand, the sun's going to draw it out, and it has lain there. And the primary discovery started in 1895. And we'll anticipate that and talk about that in a second. But here's another letter from 54. And I'm on the paragraph on the right-hand side. Amanias, and you'll see all the different sons of, greeting. I agree that I have sold to you the weaver's loom belonging to me. And look at all the descriptions. He says how long it is, the rollers. There are receipts that have gone through the bank. The price has been agreed upon. I will guarantee the sale. It goes on and on. The note of this hand is valid. That's about 8 or 9 lines down. And then notice this. This is why they know it's in 54. Tiberius Claudius, Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Imperator, however you pronounce that, the 15th month. This is during the reign of Claudius. So, and the ones that have the listing of the emperors, and of course we're not used to 6 to 8 different names, but this is written during the reign of Claudius. And if you remember through Acts recently, it's going to be in 49 that he gives the decree for all the Jews to leave Rome, which I think is the shape and the background of the writing of the book of Romans. But here's the last 2 little lines, and notice this. We have two people who are going to be witnesses to this letter. I, Aeneas, have sold the loom and have received the price of 20 drachma of silver and will guarantee the sale as foresaid. I, Heraclides, wrote for him, and why? There are several of these, but let me just give this as an example. If Brad and I are business partners, whether just through business or through family, and again, we're up and down the Nile, and if we are both illiterate, okay, we can't do a telephone, can't do a fax, and on and on. And so what had been worked out is that there have actually been letter writing manuals that have survived. Wouldn't do this probably with your grandkids. You'll catch on pretty quick. Did anybody have a typing class where you had different types of formats for a business letter? Help me, different formats for, but you know what I'm saying? When someone gave you a letter and it's this particular type, then there's this instruction, okay, for this letter, then it goes this, 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 and this. Everybody understand that for today? And so I need to send a message to my business partner, but neither one of us can read or write. So I go to a scribe. He may be under a tree, he may be at the corner, but we know where he's at. And the first thing I do is say, I'm sending a letter to my business partner, which then is going to define the tone and the word that we're going to use when we make the request. And I'll just give him a brief summary. I need him to either to sell or to buy or to deposit or to do something. And so I dictate this letter to the scribe on my behalf. And here's a very, very important part of the first century, that there is no postal system for common people. There is for the government, but there's not for the common people. And so if you have someone who's taking a trip, if you find a soldier, if you find a businessman, you would really, really, really have to trust a slave to send him with money off by himself. And a lot of these letters are written on the spot because they find, oh, somebody's going that direction. And so even though I write the letter, it can't get there unless we got somebody to take it. And in the circle around Paul, look at all these people: Timothy, Titus, Epaphroditus, Tychicus, all of these different people. They are indispensable because without these guys, like for example, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Paul's in prison in Rome and they don't hear from him unless there's somebody to do that. So we find a guy, he's going upstream where Brad is. And so here's a guy who's illiterate. And what does he do when he gets a letter? He goes and finds his scribe on that end. And because of the format of like the business letter type thing, these guys have been trained to know how to structure this, how to put it together, so that one illiterate, through a scribe, can dictate a letter, and there are specific terms that are used where we're going to say, I urge you, I beseech you, I beg you, I ask of you. Verses start sounding familiar in our New Testament. And when you hear that, that's the behavioral objective for the letter, because why go to this trouble to send letters between two illiterates if he can't understand what we're going to say? And so today we might underline or bold or all caps to say this is really important. So when you came to the point of saying this is what I want you to do, then there are some very specific terms that are there. And because of those, Brad gets the letter, takes it to his scribe, bingo, he knows exactly what I'm asking him to do. Now stop and think. The estimates vary, but in some areas the literacy was maybe 30%. Do you hear Paul telling Timothy, give attention to the public? Why are we really focusing on the public reading of Scripture? Because he can't go home and read it at home. And so that's a really, really important part of the services. And there are cultures today where people aren't as literate, and what they get at church is really, really critical. And so there are several of these, but again, I just wanted to give you a sample. Here's a note sent to two different people, and at the very end, we find out, okay, even people who are illiterate can communicate because the conventions are there. Now, if you'll turn the page, this is the one that just says Philemon. What I'd like you to do, and we'll just take just a few minutes, just go ahead and just start scanning down. And I put 3 questions at the very bottom. Number 1, what's the tone of this letter? 2, what does Paul want Philemon to do? And how does he make that specific request? You know, what's the terminology? What's the vocabulary? And then when Philemon puts the letter down, he's going to know exactly why Paul wrote the letter. So just kind of read through and look for a beseech, beg, urge term, which is going to be typical of this is the behavior that I want you to do. This is the action I want you to take. And I'll just let you kind of read through. Let me mention a couple of things and we'll walk into this. I'm using the word pun. The word Onesimus means useful or beneficial. Useful has become useless and ran away. When you know that Onesimus' name means useful, beneficial, helpful, and out in the prairie, out here on the Midwest, it would be a lot easier to get away during harvest season than it would be the dead of winter in terms of trying to just mix into the flow of traffic. Do you know what I'm trying to say by that? If you're going to run away, you don't want to wait when no one's on the road but you. And so if you can wait to kind of a high productive, high travel area, that's going to be your best chance as a runaway slave to get away. But that's also going to be at a higher cost to your master, because when you really, really need him, is going to be the best time for him to shoot through and to be gone. And so the pun involved in this is that useless has become useful. But what's the request? Very specifically, what does Paul ask him to do? Okay. Okay, and look at the term, look in verse 8. Though I am bold enough in Christ to command you what is required, yet for love's sake I prefer to, and what's the word? Appeal. And this is what we're going to be looking for. I appeal to you, I urge you, I beg you, I beseech you, is going to be sprinkled. Like, for example, it's not in the book of Colossians, but it's going to be in all the other letters to churches. It's going to be in Timothy. It's going to be in Peter. And when the writer gets ready to say, this is what I want you to do, then the word appeal, and we're going to come back to this word later, but I just wanted you to see how it functions tonight. This is the behavioral objective of the letter. Roy?
Would that be what we call a petition verb?
Yeah. Yeah. So the more formal ones are petitions, and we're going to use the word request, but it's the same type thing. And again, just you'll see this later in looking at this, but here's a real familiar one. I urge you that you all be united, that you all speak the same things, that there be no divisions among you. So right off the bat, he hits the Corinthians right between the eyes, and there's no doubt, there's no if, there's no and right off the bat, and sometimes the petition is going to be later in the letter, but when Paul gets ready to say, this is what I want you to do. And in the same way, when Brad takes my note and goes to the scribe, and it says, I urge you, I beg you, I appeal to you, then he doesn't have any doubt, this is why he wrote, this is what the letter means, this is what I'm supposed to do. Now let's keep reading. I appeal to you, and don't let it occur to you that I'm an old man with arthritis and I've been beat up and I'm in prison. Just don't let that cross your mind. And then here it is in verse 10. I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment. Do you see how specific that is? And so, some of my Australian friends would use the term buttering him up. But here's the thing. Especially back in the 70s, we had a lot of contact with the Boston movement, and here's a new Christian, and they would link them to a senior prayer partner. And there were just such terrible casualties from that. And I listened to a fellow who was doing a lesson in Cersei, and he just made a very interesting point. He said, the righteous will live by faith. And if a new Christian only has a mustard seed faith, we must allow them to live by the faith that they have, or they're not living by faith. Follow that transition? And see, then trying to link a new Christian to an older person's maturity and decisions, and then they'd have a senior prayer partner and all this other stuff. As soon as they do that, then the new Christian's not living by faith. So as an apostle, Paul could come in and slap the table and say, take him back. But in doing so, he's destroying the faith relationship, one, with Paul and Onesimus. And then, Brad, how are you going to feel toward your slave if you were forced to bring useless back on board when you'd prefer just to put him in jail when you first saw him? But then if Paul leaves it up to you and says, you know, yes, I'm an old man and I'm in prison and I've got arthritis and I'm aching, but I'm sure you'll do the right thing. Oh, and by the way, get a guest room ready because I'll be happy to come see how you guys are getting on in a little while. Here to me is just the absolute model of diplomacy. Now, if you are Onesimus, what are you going to do after you get a letter like this? BJ, are you going to slap him in prison?
I think he's going to make up the guest room for Paul.
And what I want you to see is that here is one of these conventions that we're going to see is used over and over again in letters. And guess what? When then we start reading our New Testament, because the writers are writing to be understood, when it comes time to say, this is what I want you to do, very, very seldom is Paul going to order either churches or individuals. His style of ministry, his preference is to say, I urge you, I beseech you, I appeal to you, I beg you. And here's to me what happens. That allows the person on the other side to choose to make the decision based on their faith and based on their ability to choose, rather than feeling that apostle came and he just put the hammer down and I didn't have any choice. And this is going to just run all the way through our letters.
Well, Paul's kind of using mind games with a billy club of sincerity.
Paul did use force in Galatians.
And excellent. And what we're going to see is that there's a verb that's used when you write to the governor to show distance. There's a verb that I found 3 women writing to their divorced husbands to show distance. And so when Paul comes to Galatians, that's going to be the verb that he uses, because to use the normal family, we're getting on well, everything's going good, goes against the tone of the letter. And so when we come to the petition, and we'll, like I said, we'll work through that, but you're exactly right. The Galatian church is the only church he doesn't use the word saint in. There's no thanksgiving, there's no I'm glad that, it's like you guys take the cake. And so because of the distance, then when it comes time for the appeal, then we're going to use the same word that a lady's going to be using in divorce proceedings against her husband, because buddy and love and all of this is not appropriate. And the tone of the letter, and see, you put your finger right on it, the tone of the letter then is going to dictate one of 3 different words that are going to be used. And where there's distance, then Paul will use a totally different word. Begin to see how it's going to function in terms of the tone of the letters. We're going to go through this fairly quickly. I'll leave you to read parts of this. But this will just give you some background about where the letters came from and how they're going to be written. We did this on Sunday morning recently. I'm in about the mid-300s, and Philip of Macedon, so Macedonian call, Paul going across into Europe. Philip of Macedon is the ruler, and being a humble guy, he names a city after himself that we know as Philippi. And then Alexander's half-sister is Thessaloniki, and so they named Thessalonica after Alexander's half-sister. And so the father gets killed. Alexander's 18 years old. He gets the Macedonians together. They march down to Greece, and they say, you guys need to surrender. And Thebes said no. And they just literally decimate the place. They take it over, sell everybody into slavery, and everyone else says, we're with you, we're going to help. And Alexander says, let's go rescue our Greek relatives on the west side of Turkey, Asia Minor. And that developed a 10-year campaign where Alexander went all the way to India. Before that, there were just a whole host of different Greek dialects, and they were very proud of these. They were very didn't want to change. But guess what happens if you have young men in the army and in tents and fighting together for 10 years? If you can't communicate, you get killed. I don't like the word survival of the fittest, but the koine, which is going to become the language of the New Testament, the common Greek developed in the tents of Alexander's army, and you start from Greece and you end up, and they go down through Palestine, Egypt, Upper Africa, come back up, the rest of Persia, and finally in India, the soldier says, we're not going any further. But in 10 years, by the time Alexander conquers that, then the Koine Greek is this common Greek that develops in the tents of Alexander's army. It would never have happened in Greece. He's 18 when he starts, and he dies 10 years later. Each of the generals are very young, and our concerns are, it's a silent P, but it's the Ptolemies, P-T-O-L. The Ptolemies control Egypt. The Seleucids do Syria. And initially, Palestine is controlled by the Egyptians, and then eventually the Syrians take over. But as one of our Greek teachers said, being the modest fellow that he was, Alexander only named 31 cities after himself. But the city that survived was Alexandria in Egypt. And the Ptolemies decided, we are going to become the intellectual, academic, outside of Athens center of the world. And at one time, the library in Alexandria had 700,000 scrolls in it. not books. I mean, imagine how many buildings you're going to have to house 700,000 scrolls. So virtually all of the literature that's come from the Greek world, I'm talking about just Homer, Sophocles, all these different writers, has come to us through Alexandria because they had multiple copies and on and on. And that was just the kind of the place. About two-thirds way down, I use this term lingua franca. This Koine became the trade language. And as one of my teachers said, what English is today, internationally, is what then Greek became. And so every family who wanted to kind of be ahead and get ahead, the first thing they said was, we have to have our boys learn Greek. And that's where then the trade language it developed and it went on from there. Let's go ahead and turn the page. I'll leave you some details to look at. Alexander is going to die in 323, and Greeks, Hellenists are going to control Palestine until the coming of the Romans. And if you remember Nebuchadnezzar's statue in Daniel chapter 2, the head is of gold. And who was the head? Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar. And then you have the middle section is going to be of silver, and that's going to be the Medes. And then like the thighs are going to be made of bronze, and that's going to be the Greeks. And so Alexander begins the fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, translated, given the meaning to him by Daniel in chapter 2. And then he says, and in the days of those kings, talking about the feet made of clay and iron, the Lord will establish a kingdom which shall not be shaken, and neither shall dominion be left to another. And so through prophecy, God gives Daniel the historical narrative of 4 different kingdoms rising and falling to the coming of Jesus in the days of the feet of the statue. So Alexander is going to be the thighs of that statue. But what's going to take place is that because they had spread Greek culture all across, when the Romans conquer, they typically call the Eastern Roman Empire, and all the trade, commercial language, and everything else is done in Greek. You're going to be close to the 400s before Latin comes in, even in the Eastern Roman Empire. And then stop and think about this. Paul writes to the Christians in Rome in Greek. Now, in 63, and that's at the very top, the General Pompey, he actually kind of came in 66 as a peacekeeping force. They attacked Jerusalem. A number of Jews were killed. And from 63 for the next hundreds and hundreds of years, then the Romans are going to be the primary conquerors of Palestine. So Paul is going to grow up. What's his home city? Tarsus. And one of my Greek teachers said it this way. He said, and I'm using English terms, and of course here's the British influence. He said, the Oxford of the ancient world was Athens. The Cambridge was Alexandria. And then the next most influential university in the Eastern Greek Empire was in Tarsus. Remember our old typewriters, ding, ding. Paul is a Hebrew of Hebrews. Well, let me take a half step back. Do you remember when Pilate put the inscription on the cross? He wanted it written in 3 totally different languages so that anybody who could read in the first century could understand the embarrassment of what was taking place. And it's written in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, yes. And guess what? Hebrew of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day of the tribe of Benjamin. He dictates his letters in Greek because Tertius at the end of Romans wrote this letter. He knows Greek so well that he can dictate it to be done. And I was born a Roman citizen. Paul's nationalities are the three nationalities of the languages that are nailed over our Lord's head when he's died. And that's why he is selected as the apostle to the Gentiles, because he comes born in the cradle of Judaism, but he grew up in a very academic, Greek-oriented university town, and then he's a Roman citizen. And so wherever he goes in the Eastern Roman Empire, then he shares those cultures, and that was part of God choosing him. Now, see the LXX? Between 270 to 250, 70 Jewish rabbis get together in Alexandria to translate the Hebrew Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. So make a mental note. Alexander dies in 323. Within 50 years, Hebrews are thinking, if we don't translate the Old Testament into Greek, our grandkids may not be able to read it. What does that tell you is taking place? Many even of the Hebrews are learning Greek and are being schooled in Greek. And so when you see the LXX, the Roman numerals for 70, then 70 Jewish scholars got together, and within this 20-year period of time, they translated our books of Genesis to Malachi from Hebrew, a bit of Aramaic, into Greek. Anticipate. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Galatians 4:4. Paul will go into a city, will go into a synagogue, and most of the synagogues in the diaspora, when it's time to read from the scriptures, they're going to be reading from the Greek Old Testament. 90% of our quotations in our New Testament come from the Septuagint, from the Greek New Testament. The first adult education, would you like to learn? Well, let me take a step back. We have friends that teach people to read English using the Gospel of Luke today. Most of you know people that do that. Well, they're not going to do it on the Sabbath day, okay? But most towns had a trade day. Everybody came in from the country, set up shop and everything else. And let's say it's Thursday. Then the synagogue would announce, if you want to teach your grandsons Greek, you come in and set up your shop, but then send them to the Greek school in the synagogue, and we will help them to learn Greek. And guess what they put under their nose? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So to learn Greek, then they used the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And this is where we come across that kind of special group of people in the New Testament called the God-fearers. They're not proselytes. They haven't been circumcised. But many of them will keep the Sabbath, observe so many of the regulations. And how did they learn to do that? If he grows up learning Greek, reading the book of Genesis, and you guys are just Gentiles, guess what's going to happen if he does this for 3 or 4 or 5 years? And over a period of time, he's going to develop a faith in Yahweh, in the Lord. He's going to give up a whole lot of other practices. And so I use the word evangelism in quotations, but it was, as people then came to be able to learn Greek, then they stuck the Old Testament under their nose, and a whole group of people come to know and believe and understand in God that otherwise wouldn't have known him at all. We're not given any details, but Acts 10 is a decade after Pentecost. And how is Cornelius described? He is a righteous. How does a Roman centurion ever become a righteous, God-fearing man? Somewhere he's introduced to and will come to know a part of the Old Testament. And so a part of the fullness of time, we're going to have the Greek language that everybody can communicate all through the Eastern Roman Empire. We're going to have the Roman roads. We're going to have safety that we haven't had in centuries. We have a common currency with the Greek coins. And we now have a Greek Old Testament to teach people the gospel from, to help them to become Christians as we're establishing the church. And look at all these things that God brings together in the fullness of time when Jesus comes into the world. The second one, yes. And please jump in anytime you want to ask something. It's an open door. I'll go like a runaway train, but you stop anytime you need to. Go.
You kind of pulled that all together as, you know, all these people could speak Greek and they had a common language and things. Did you mean to say that Timothy was probably illiterate?
No.
So Paul is highly literate.
Yes.
And he's working with Timothy, and Timothy's a preacher. Was Timothy going to listen to the public reading, or was he doing the public reading?
Doing the public reading.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good clarification. That's why it's so important that when we have assemblies, well, let me take a step back. We had this wonderful, 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 godly couple in my home church, and we had a center aisle, and they would always sit right here. He was full-blood American Indian. Brother Weaver couldn't read. Wonderful man, wonderful man. But as young men, when we gave devotionals, when we read scripture, not in services, but we were always told, speak up when you read so Brother Weaver can hear very clearly, because he's getting older. But on the second row, he never missed a service because that was his one chance to hear the word. There's going to be millions of people in heaven who heard the gospel. And here's something very significant. And I would never have thought about this without, I did a class on history writing in the ancient world. And one of the themes was the New Testament was written for the ear before it was written for the eye. Okay, I don't want this to be gross, but it's just a fact. People who work in the New York sewer system can tell you when commercials come on TV. In the ancient world, if you wanted to have a party to end all parties, there were guys that had memorized virtually, and it would be maybe a 4 or 5 hour recitation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so as the parents of the groom, if you wanted to do something in addition to the other wedding, when they had a really special occasion, they would hire these guys and they would recite Homer's Iliad and Odyssey 4 or 5 hours a night.
Sybil just said no.
Well, Harold Red, some of you met Harold Red, beloved black brother in Memphis. Nokomis Yeldale was at the other large black church. When Mrs. Nokomis Yeldale died, it was a 5 hour funeral. So when we kick this off, we say, here's where the restrooms are. And at a certain point in time, if you want to go to the fellowship hall, there's coffee and lemonade and sandwiches and refreshments. And if you're going to have a 5 or 6 hour funeral, Greg, can you imagine getting ready? The building for a 5 to 6 hour funeral. And you read every letter from every church that sent in condolences and other stuff. No one's going to sit through all of it. But the idea is just quiet. When you need to leave, quietly do that. But we're going to be here for 5 or 6 hours for this funeral. Well, again, go back. My great-grandmother was born in the 1800s, and in 1901, she's 18 years old, has 3 little boys, 4 and under, and gets on a train and comes to Indian Territory. Olivia, how old are you? I'm 18. Can you imagine? You got married at 14 years and 9 months. And you live in Nebraska, and at 18, you get on a train and you come to Indian Territory. It's October, it's too late to build a house. He comes on the next train in the boxcar. Livestock, he rides the farm equipment, furniture on pallets. It's too late to build a house, so we build a dugout in the side of the hill. If you go to Sayre, there's truck stops about 2 miles before Sayre when you go over the ride on those hills. They dig a dugout, they kill one of the animals to have a skin for the door, and my family spends their first winter sleeping on the rock floor on skins with a skin for the door during ice and snow and sleet storms. When you don't have any TV, you don't have any radio, church, and the listening to scripture and the reading and the listening becomes your lifeline for so many social and intellectual things. Because, I mean, you just think about this. You imagine taking care of 3 little boys and you're cooking on some type of fire on a pot and you're sleeping on a rock floor and you have a skin for the door for the winter. In the book of Acts, 25% of the book of Acts is sermons. And my history teacher said sermons function like commercials. If you're listening to the recitation of the book of Acts, then you're not moving, you're not going somewhere. And so when it's time to kind of go, okay, kind of like we do in commercials, then speeches then function to kind of let you catch your breath, kind of listen in, and then when it gets through, then the movement goes on. And so people were accustomed, and again, if you don't have TV and entertainment, people love to do that. So always remember, our New Testament was written for the ear before it was written for the eye. Let me do these next 2, and let's take a stretch break. Then we won't go too long after we have our break. Inscriptions are things written on stone, and this is too good to pass up. If you live in the ancient world, especially the first century, and let's say at a point in time, Jonah Mace is going to build a small house, for a young family. Guess what one of the greatest challenges is to a house in the ancient world? You don't have rubber, you don't have stops, you don't have plastic. Guess what a real challenge is? To find a flat enough stone to build the door frame right over the top of a flat stone to seal the cold as much as you can. And guess where some of the best flat stones are? Cemeteries. There are inscriptions all over the walls of ancient cities. And so Solomon and Jonah Mace would kind of go on this scouting trip, getting ready to build this house. And we wouldn't do it during a full moon. But they would locate, because of the size of door we're going to have, see all the building that's going to go into this, and we're going to build a house. Australians use this wonderful word, nick. They're going to go out and nick this stone some night on a dark night. And the first thing they're going to do is turn that baby over and start building the doors and the front wall, because they now have a flat, secure surface to try to seal off the cold in the wintertime. Every time a house or an old building is found in Turkey, most of the time they stop and they call in archaeologists until they find the front door. Now stop and think. If that stone had been left out where it was, what's going to happen over 2,000 years? Erosion, military campaigns, broken up for other building things. And because of the creativity of young men like Jonah Mace and Solomon of nicking these inscriptions and turning that baby over, so you really couldn't, isn't that wonderful? We worked really hard to get this really flat stone so she would be comfortable and we didn't have a draft then coming in. And so in the foreseeable future, as long as they're doing excavations and building new buildings, new inscriptions are going to keep coming out of Asia Minor. Isn't that amazing? And so in a lot of these inscriptions, again, are a whole number of words that are used in our New Testament. If you look then on the last page, for now. This is page 3. We're going to do this and stop, and then we'll come back and do some more of this later. I think it was there was a Lightfoot who was a New Testament student, and this is, like I said, on page 3, Papyri in Egypt. And I read this comment years ago. He said, if we could only have found literature from the first century, it would be so interesting to compare the vocabulary of the New Testament with the vocabulary of the first century. Well, in the late 1800s, and it was an accident initially, they start finding these dumps, tips, and you see in bold the word oxyrhynchus. So I'll give you a map later, but watch my hand for a second. Here comes the Nile, and there's just a little kind of river off the side that makes a loop. So people can live there, but it doesn't get all the overflow of the Nile. And we'll, like I said, I'll show you this later, but Oxyrhynchus is a little town there. Between Grenville and Hunt, between, I want to say, 1895 and 1907 is in my mind. They excavate this. To date, they have only translated about 2/3 of what they found up to 1907, but 86 volumes have been published so far from what these guys found from 1895 to 1907. They're normally these wonderful gray, tall books, and they have been reprinted in paperback. This is volume 2. But like I said, they're about 2/3 through, and so far 86 volumes have been published from just this one place. And so there's dozens of these in different parts of Egypt. So you can begin to see what Lightfoot wished for in the 1800s. We now have access to inscriptions and papyri, which then give us parallels to how the language was used that people in previous centuries could only have hoped for. So if you look on page 4, back at page 3, like I said, because it doesn't rain, then these things were stored there, and like I said, baskets and baskets were found. They're stored in boxes, museum temperature. Every major university in Europe has papyri that someone has found or bought or has done, and so there's just entire volumes. And so at Macquarie, we had a whole wall of volumes of just papyri that had been published. And then there's some on microfiche, and microfilm was the words I couldn't think of earlier. And so because of that, then we just have access to the vocabulary of the New Testament that we wouldn't have any other way. I'll try to bring this next time. 2 things, and then let's take a stretch. There were 2 British scholars, Moulton and Milligan, who, as this starts coming out, late 1800s, early 1900s, they decide we're going to find as many parallels in inscriptions and papyri as we can, and it's about this thick, and it's called Moulton and Milligan. I always have to stop and look. Moulton died in 1917. That's number 4. He was on a ship that was torpedoed by the Germans. He made it to a life raft, but he died in the life raft before he got there. So he dies in 1917. His buddy keeps working on it, and they published Moulton and Milligan in 1930, and it hasn't been revised since then. Here's a marker. In 1976, 4,000 articles were published on inscriptions and papyri in German, French, Latin, and English. That's 1 year. And this thing has not been touched since 1930. So when I go back to Australia, I have a dear friend who's finally retired, very fluent in Greek and Latin, and he's trying to spend the last part of his years revising Moulton and Milligan and finding parallels that are from, here's like our word gospel, our word joy, and those other things. I don't know if he's going to live long enough to get it done, but at least he's working on that, and that's just a very interesting thing. And you think about this, as members of the church, we're totally convinced that holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. This isn't just words, it isn't just history. This is inspired by God. And what's amazing is that there are thousands of copies of the New Testament, and the variants, the textual variants, are between 1% and 2%. A scribe may have missed a vowel here or something else. All the significant things, there's no doubt about the text that we have in the New Testament. And then God waits for 2,000 years and allows us to find all of these discoveries. And so we now have, here's the word in the New Testament, but here's how it was used in letters, here's how it was used in inscriptions, here's how people in the first century would have heard this. And just above that dotted line, and earlier Lexington just used this comment, there's no fear that the task is completed. There will be no more parallels, and these are parallels to the New Testament. One who gives himself to this task cannot escape the feeling how great is the ocean and how tiny is the shell with which we dip. And so it's amazing to me that in our lifetime we have parallels and we have an understanding of the vocabulary that's in our New Testament that has not been known until just this last recent century. And that's a real blessing. So let's take a break. We're equal opportunity because the next one will be a complaint against a wife. What I'm going to do for samples, and again, I'll give you this more in print next time. There are 4 different terms that are used when it says time to do something. All of these samples are, and if you look, you see the Greek word that's highlighted in yellow? It's oxio. You'll see the A and the O at the end. See about 2/3 of the way down the inscription. Okay. All of these are samples of this particular term, and this term is not found in the New Testament, but it is the most general, and I use the word nameless and faceless. So if you're writing to a government official, you don't know who they are. If you're writing to a clerk in a store, in other words, if there's no relationship that's there, it's not appropriate to use one of these near and dear terms, and you sure don't want to use this if you're wanting them to do something. So each night we'll have some samples, primarily from the first century, a few from the second. And I just wanted you to see, now this is how this is used in letters. And I'll have some things for you to look at from our New Testament through the week while we're gone. But then once we've kind of read through these, and you go home sometime this week, go back again and read Philemon, because we're going to start with that as a sample. And guess what you're going to find? Just exactly the same way that these terms are used in these different inscriptions is going to be exactly how they're going to be used in the letters in the New Testament. The word will be different, but the petition, the request, is going to be there. So, and I never get tired of this, somewhere between 20 to 50 AD, okay? We're in Egypt, and think what's going on in Palestine. Jesus is still alive. Paul's going to write 1 Thessalonians in 51. So somewhere between the life of Jesus and Paul being out on his missionary journeys, then this is when this takes place. So it's a petition, and there's all kinds of these government officials that have different titles. But this is a woman who has been deserted by her husband and wished to recover the dowry that she had brought to the marriage. So he's not only run out on her, then if he leaves her, then she's supposed to be able to get the dowry back that she brought when it came in. So if you look at the very bottom, she's writing to the priest, the chief justice, and the superintendent. So stop and think. She doesn't have a personal relationship. Do you see what I'm saying in terms of government official, someone that she doesn't know, but she has no clout. She has no way to order. She has no way to say, you must do this. And so when she writes this letter at a certain point, and he will understand this by the nature of his office, at a certain point, she's going to switch over to a petition, to a request verb, and so he'll know exactly why she wrote the letter. He'll know exactly what she wants him to do. And so here is this complaint against her husband. I married Hartman, bringing him by cession a dowry, 200 drachma of silver. As he was destitute of means, I received him into my parents' house, and I conducted myself blamelessly in all respects. So already, what is she trying to do in terms of the information that she's giving? What? Well, okay, he's left her, but can I use the term that we hear sometimes in the church today? I'm the innocent party. Everybody know what I'm trying to say by that? And notice how she's going to then develop that kind of line by line. She's saying, I did what's right, and he's a dog. Well, and I'm not denying that it may be true, but I'm just saying, and watch how she's going to go about doing this, because, again, she can't command him. She has no authority. And so at a certain point, then she has to appeal to him, either because of his office or maybe his character, or maybe he will feel sorry for her because of all the stuff that's happened. And so he squandered my dowry as he pleased. He continually ill-treated and insulted me, using violence toward me, deprived me of the necessities of life, and finally, he deserted me, leaving me in a state of destitution. And watch, I therefore beg you. So if you write on these, either circle that or underline that, and notice what's going to happen after that. I beg you to order him to be brought before you in order that he may be compelled to pay back my dowry, increased by half to its amount. This petition is without prejudice to any other claims which I have or may have against him. Now, if you're the person receiving the letter, you have no doubt what is she wanting you to do? Drag him in. Ascertain the facts, and since I'm the one that's in the right and he has mistreated me, and notice when you come to that petition term, I beg you to order him to be brought before you, is the behavioral objective of the petition. Everybody okay? And again, I'm not trying to talk down to you, but I want you just to see, once you kind of see how clear this is. And so here's contemporary letters with our New Testament. And when it comes time to say, this is what I want you to do, I'm convinced, and by the time we get through, hopefully you'll be able to see this, I'm convinced that when they got through reading Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, then the audience had a very clear idea, this is exactly what Paul is wanting me to do as a result of this letter.
Bill,
Yes.
her opening kind of reminds me of Luke's writing, because he's writing to somebody who's
Yes. And there's going to be a sense of respect. There's going to be a sense of the distance. And when we give these four terms, we're going to call this one a formal petition, because, again, there's kind of the nameless and the faceless part, and well, let me rephrase that. Let's call it a routine position, because we don't know the people involved. The formal one's going to be the one in Galatians where we show the distance. Okay? Equal opportunity. We now have a complaint against a wife. Didn't want anybody to leave tonight feeling like this was just a one-sided situation. And Do you see what I'm saying? And the percentage of there's so many other documents that aren't letters, but that's why it was always amazing to read through these different volumes, and most of them will either have personal letters or they'll have an index where they'll have these petition words in them. So I would go to them, come to the index and say, okay, are there personal letters that are in this particular volume? So here's another one, and we're going to be AD 30 to 35. To Alexandrius, and look at all the titles that are there, of the city of Oxyrhynchus. I married Demetrius, daughter of Heraclides, and I, for my part, provided for my wife in a manner that exceeded my resources. Does any of this sound familiar? And so you can just see through the years I've just sat in the library and read this and would just die laughing, and people wonder what on earth is going on. It will come back to me. We had a term when I was dating that meant she was not cheap, which when it wasn't a compliment, there's another term will come back to mind. But anyway, I exceeded my means to try to take care of my wife. And so you can see what's going to happen in the early part of these petitions. And then, but, dun 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 dun, she became dissatisfied with our union and finally left the house, carrying off property that belonged to me, a list which is added below. I beg, therefore, that she be brought before you. See how clear it is? That she may receive her, I don't like the word deserts, but you know what he's trying to say, and return to me my property. This petition is without prejudice to the other claims, and on, and there was a break, and so we don't know what all the items were. But you see how clear it is? I want you to bring her back in, and that's going to be the behavioral objective of that petition. Okay, the next one.
Yeah, we gotta read that last part.
Pardon?
We gotta read that last part. Well,
Yes, the plural indicates he had an accomplice, very likely. Her mother was concerned, and then another petition is written, 2 years later. So this is kind of like, as the world turns, what days of our lives are. So now we're at 44, and after the Romans came in, unless you were a Roman citizen, you had very strict tax responsibilities, both in terms of land, in terms of animals, in terms of produce, and in terms of slaves. And so as you go into this later in the 2nd century, the economy started declining, and people would literally run away to avoid their tax things. And so I just underlined this simple line. The removal of an inhabitant from his abode was regarded by the authorities in Egypt with much suspicion, often being resorted to for the purpose of evading taxation. So knowing that's what is at issue, then we're going to write to a government official in 44, and we're going to explain this is a legitimate transfer, removal. We need him taken off of the tax roll so we don't have to pay for him since he's not here. Okay, so here it comes. To Didymus, and then there's a whole list of people. Again, the city of Oxyrhynchus. My son, who has no trade, and all of a sudden you think, okay, that tells you a lot right there. My son, who has no trade, registered in the quarter some time ago, removed abroad. Here it comes. Wherefore, I ask that his name be entered in the list of persons removed, henceforth from this year, which is at, and here comes Tiberius Claudius, the whole list, and I swear that this is correct. He doesn't possess any means, And besides that, he's left and he's moved. Basically, we don't want our family taxed for another person who's not here. But what's the term in this petition? The translator said what? I ask his name be entered and be removed. Okay, we're about done on these. Well, that's not true. We got a couple of them, but this one is a tax collector, and you'll see that two different people. The one on the right actually was written first, so let's read it first. A weaver of Oxyrhynchus lived in, I'm on the right-hand bottom side, lived in the quarter of the square. Apolloniphanes, the ex-collector of taxes, extorted from me among other people 16 drachma of silver. Therefore I beg you to proceed against him as you may think fit. See how clear the petition is? And then when you read the one on the left, it's the same guy and the same complaint is made. He also extorted 16 drachma of silver. I beg you to proceed against him. And so those are going to be two complaints that are given on a tax collector, but there was the petition. Okay, last one's on this page. Here's a petition, and we have a runaway slave, and they've actually captured him, and there's some details about what has taken place. And you'll see in that first paragraph on the very bottom of the left that they have found him, and in the break, I am therefore impelled to present this petition, and I beg you, if you think fit, to keep the slave guarded and to send word and on and on. But it's very specific. We've captured a runaway slave. Here's the petition. This is what I want you to do as a result of that. And then in 61, again, he is reporting the death of his slave, so he won't be due any taxes on the slave in his household. And you read through the list. Again, a weaver. He died during absence, and then he gives the years of Nero Claudius, goes through the whole list. I request that his name be inscribed in the list of dead persons, and I swear by the emperor that this is true, and then the dates that are there. So let me give you one sheet, give you a couple comments, and we're done. You want to pass this one out? Temple, do you have the 3 columns?
This one?
Yeah.
I just brought that tonight from.
Yeah.
when you passed out earlier.
Well, next week I'll give you there's 3 different columns of things that are in our letters. And one of the important things to notice is there is always this opening, this prologue, this beginning. And how do you tell when you've gone from that into the middle part of the letter? And so what we'll have, one column will be blue, and then pink, and then green. And we'll have the different items that are in the opening and the closing of letters. But typically, the major transition from the opening into the body will be one of these terms. You think either I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant, as for you, you know. And think about a telephone conversation. If we call someone that we know well but we haven't talked to for a long time, what's the first part of our conversation? How are you doing? How are the kids? How's your health? How's your mom? And it's just this general opening greeting of the stuff. And that's very much what takes place in the opening of our letters. And at some point, something like this will be said in some conversations. Oh, the reason I called was, and here's this whole first part of relationship and conversation and really not the real reason, but we're just catching up. So next week when we look at that, that will be in the opening of the letter. But when Paul gets ready to say, this is why I wrote, I want you to read, if it doesn't have a number, it's Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 1, 2 Corinthians, but it will start in Ephesians 2, Colossians 2, 1 Thessalonians 2, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians. And notice at some point he will say either, I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant. And it's kind of like when he moves to the body of the lesson, he kind of points a finger at the people that he's writing to say, this is why I'm going to write this particular letter. The other thing that happens, and just a heads up, because it'll look a little bit confusing, in 1 Corinthians, the petition, I urge you to be united, is in chapter 1 and verse 10, and that's probably the transition into the body there. So sometimes our petitions will be later in the letter, like we'll see them in Romans 12 and other places. But I want you just to be noticing, and once we work through this next week, in the Bible that I carry, I literally draw a line above, I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant. And a lot of times I will photocopy that and photocopy the end of the letter, and we'll just read both of those because typically Paul will introduce his main ideas in the opening part of the letter, and then when he says, I want you to know, I don't want you to be unaware, I want you to be ignorant, as for you, then he's moved into that middle part, and he will start expanding on something that he brought up in the opening of the letter. And then typically, somewhere in the closing, he'll come back and touch on that. Again, if I was doing the junior high class, this would be a little harder to explain. But if I say Grandma's T-post clothesline, everybody here knows what I'm talking about? You know, got the T-post welded and got the wires that ran through. And so somewhere in the opening is going to be the first T-post. He'll introduce this. If he comes back and discusses it in the closing, then we have the T-post for this letter, and all the themes and all the things that happen in the letter are going to be strung on the line between the two T-posts. Everybody understand what we're saying? So, and then the second one is just glance ahead. And again, I think it's better for you just to kind of explore and to kind of find these yourselves. Look for, I urge you, I beseech you, I beg you, I appeal to you. So the bottom part of the page is, and some of these are very early in these chapters, but still, just read through and put down the verse and maybe just a short comment about it. And you can kind of see where this is going, because this was the means of saying, this is what I want you to do. Here is the reason that I wrote. Here's, like for example, bring in my husband. Bring in my, and we see this functioning in these letters in that context. And guess what? Then when Paul writes his letters, then he's going to use the same conventions that people are using to write to people in the first century. And so here's what's important. I don't think it's the only thing, but every time I teach a letter, I put a great deal of stress on the I urge you, I beg you, the petitions, because this is, to my understanding, when they put that thing down or when they had listened to it, it was like, we know exactly what he's asking us to do. And so if at least we are stressing the same things that Paul was stressing, then we're not just bringing in something from the outside that may or may not have had anything to do with the letter. And so where this functions with me is that as I teach a book, then I want to find, and we'll talk about this as we come, the opening, main key statements, the closing, is there a common thing there? And then when we have a petition, and let's go ahead and do Corinthians, I urge you, here's your clothesline, I urge you that you all be united, that you all speak the same things, that there be no divisions among you. And you can hang every teaching in every chapter in the book of 1 Corinthians on that petition that runs through the T-post on the clothesline. Everybody okay with the analogy? Because I like to just do something we can kind of see that's in our world. But that's literally what I carry around in my mind. And so every time I start to study a book or do that, then I very carefully will do the opening and the closing and then see is there a petition. And then once I get those, then the rest of the reading and the other things come as a result of that. Comments, questions? Well, and like I said, if others want to come, they're welcome to. We'll add some things. But I encourage you just kind of have a look at these. And now that we've kind of covered what we did, that'll give you some things to look at, and that'll help you do that. And we'll be making application. And what we'll be doing is that we'll add different requests and petitions each night and say this is how they functioned in our New Testament and how that worked together. And depending upon the relationship, it will depend upon the verb that's used. And he hit it right on the head, because when we come to Galatians, that is the only book that has the formal distance petition, but it's because of the conflict that's between Paul and them, and his normal, I love you, family, everything's good and wonderful is not appropriate. And so the petition then will determine the tone of the letter. And I suggest that we teach with the same tone that the letter's written. Well done.